Okay, hello everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger. I'm professor of sociology, director of the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, and I am delighted to welcome you to the first of our spring book talks on migration issues, which we organize with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UCLA. As those of you who have been with us since the beginning of the year know, we meet every Friday at this time, same place, for a presentation of a new book on migration followed by comment and then exchange with the author. So next week we will discuss a new book by Karthik Ramakrishnan and Alan Colburn entitled Citizenship Reimagined, a New Framework for States' Rights in the United States. But today I'm delighted to welcome as our author Niambi Carter, who is an associate professor of political science at Howard University. And Niambi will talk about her new book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. After Niambi's presentation, we'll segue to a comment by Efrén Pérez, who's professor of political science and psychology at UCLA. We'll go back to Niambi for reactions, and then we will open up for discussion with the audience. So once we begin the discussion, you can send your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we can also make in effect, the microphone and the video available if you wish to pose your question directly. But without any further ado, let me segue to Niambi for a presentation of her book.
Thank you for that introduction, Roger. And thank you to UCLA and for the center for having me. And I bring greetings from Howard University, the Mecca, in Washington, D.C., where apparently something very crazy has happened today that I have just been getting alerts about. But I'm very thrilled to speak with you all today about my book, American While Black, because it's a topic that, as a graduate student, I came to because of my advisor's research, but certainly it became something that I was quite passionate about for various reasons. So the story for how I kind of got here and got to this dissertation is really a story about my own family. So my family is from this place with the green star. It's called Warrenton, North Carolina, in Warren County, North Carolina, at the far north of the state. Warrenton is about a town of less than 1,000 people. I think as of the last census, it might have been under 900 people in Warrenton. So it's a very small town. And Warrenton, like a lot of places in this country, is very much a Black and white place, at least racially. The city has been organized that way. The county and indeed the state have been organized along Black and white racial lines, where Blacks sort of sit at the bottom of the racial order and whites atop the racial order. And in this place of Warrenton, North Carolina, is where I really had sort of my most profound awakening about this topic of Black public opinion on immigration. And I got to this topic because of work I was doing with my advisor, Dr. Paula McClain at Duke University. But it wasn't really until I was visiting my family, and in particular, listening to my uncle have a conversation around some of these issues, that I actually knew what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. So my Uncle Al is my favorite uncle. He's a Vietnam veteran and a brick mason. And when he came back from Vietnam, one of the things he did was start a construction company. And at that construction company, he hired all of my uncles and a majority Black employees who were all skilled laborers, right? They were masons and other kinds of carpenters and, other kinds of skilled construction workers. And by the sort of early aughts, mid 2000s, my uncle was, or early 2000s, my uncle was thinking about retiring. And part of the reason that he was thinking about retiring was not just age, but the landscape had changed. And one of the things that changed that landscape was immigration. And the fact that white firms were hiring immigrant laborers. And my uncle was bidding on a job, and he was talking about it with a friend of his. And he was saying how he wouldn't get the job. He didn't expect he would get the job. And part of the reason he didn't think he would get the job is because the white company that he was competing against for this bid hired Latino labor. And of course, he didn't use that term. They hired immigrant labor. And what made that difficult for him is my uncle routinely paid his laborers about $30 an hour, whereas the firm he was competing against was paying probably a third of that to their laborers. And so he's having this conversation with his friend about these sort of dynamics. And he was like, that's how white people do. And I thought that conversation was really important because it highlighted something that I had not considered that somebody like my uncle would know. At this point, he's in his about late 50s, early 60s, and is talking about how the racial dynamics of that state had changed, right? That what we saw happening in Warrenton and what we saw happening to his business, his Black-owned business, was really a function of increased Latino immigration to the state, which had increased about 400% in the decade between 1990 and 2000. But what had not changed was sort of the racial dynamics that made that sort of exploitable labor desirable and would also potentially harm sort of Black life chances. But what I did not hear in that conversation, and what was really important to me, was any sort of animus necessarily aimed at immigrant communities. He had most of his commentary for white people. And so what I was thinking about in this, as I approached this project, was sort of the language of Gordon Allport, right? Where he said the same heat that melts the butter hardens the egg. And so here I was thinking about the stimulus of immigration and how very differently, perhaps, immigration was operating on Blacks and how differently it operated for whites. Whereas whites seemed to be hardening their boundaries, Blacks were sort of in this sort of a more amorphous space, right? They were sort of being melted, but they weren't necessarily responding in the same way as whites. So what I was trying to understand through this text is how race influences Black public opinion on immigration. It seems like a simple question, but it's certainly not one we've spent a lot of time engaging as political scientists. And where we have, I don't think we've spent a lot of time thinking about how Black people themselves talk about some of these issues. And in particular, I was concerned with how Black people are able to marshal some sort of national identity that would help in their sort of formation of these ideas about immigrant communities, right? Because being an American, I think, is something that we talk about often, but we don't necessarily consider how differently different kinds of Americans experience American identity. And indeed, if you're a Black person, that experience with America is going to look very different than a white person's, because America doesn't necessarily operate the same for everyone. And indeed, if you're someone like my uncle, right? My uncle is a child of Jim Crow. So the way that he understands his national identity is different. He essentially went from being he's experienced sort of all phases of this life of being, say, a non-voting person to being a voting person to being a sort of, provisionally voting person, right? If we're thinking about the current regime post Shelby County. But all of that is to say, being an American has not meant the same in securing Black rights as it has for white people. So when we're talking about, or at least when I'm talking about immigration, it is important, necessary, and absolutely essential, right, to understanding how differently Blacks think of themselves with respect to their nation. And then if we're thinking about approaches to Black public opinion, I think you cannot have that conversation without also having this historical piece added on to it. So I think there's a very present or presentist bias when we do some of this work where we're looking at what's happening right now. And that's understandable. But the right now is conditioned on some other things that happened before it. And so I think this history is absolutely going to be significant for how Black people connect what is happening in the present, right, to this sort of racial socialization that they have gotten through this longer sort of historical memory. And then, of course, what does it mean to be Black and what does it mean to be American? Are those things the same thing? And to the extent that they are or are not, what does it mean then for how Blacks think about something like immigration? So one of my sort of first places for starting this work is the preeminent Black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about this notion of double consciousness. And one of the things that I found here, at least, is the need to sort of decouple Americanness from Blackness and recognize sort of the citizenship part of this as sort of an administrative construct that won't necessarily open any doors for you, particularly if you're a Black person. So thinking about that then, and in particular, what Black wants are, this particular passage from the Souls of Black Folk was particularly important for me. In this highlighted part, right, this is sort of what Blacks have been striving for. Some place where they can be considered part of the body politic, but not necessarily have to sacrifice who they are as a people, right? And part of doing that, or part of sort of approaching this work then, meant that I had to sort of construct for my own self a notion of a Black identity in America. And I don't know that, you know, those things have fully sort of crystallized for me. Nonetheless, this was an important jumping off place for me to think about what citizenship means for Black people. Because at the heart of any of this, my argument is what Blacks are attempting to do is gain access to the body politic, to be considered full members and be able to participate fully in this project that we call America. Citizenship is supposed to bring that to you, but recent evidence, right? I mean, we're in the middle of a trial for Derek Chauvin, for example, who murdered a Black man in broad daylight on video, and we still have to sort of have a trial about what that means. So what that tells me as a Black person is that being a citizen doesn't necessarily make me any more secure. And if Americanness is supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of that security, then I can't count on that as a Black person. So the first thing I was thinking about was moving away from assuming, right, that because people are Black Americans or are citizens of this country, that means that they are able to exercise the same privilege with respect to immigrant groups. Likewise, scholars of interminorities relations who've helped us really think about what it looks like when people of different communities, minoritized communities, come together, have yielded, I think, some important insights. But these insights, I think, still don't quite get to where I want to go, don't approximate where I want to go. Because coalition and competition theories really leave white people out of the story, right? So on the one hand, there are those scholars of coalition who argue that shared minority status may cause groups to work together. And that might be true on some limited kinds of things. But what are they working together for? And what are they working together against? Largely their own exclusion. And that exclusion doesn't come from nowhere. That exclusion comes from the operations of white supremacy in the way that it sort of contains the life chances of these communities. The problem also is the fact that when we look at the competition theories, right, which says that because of limited goods or the sort of finite nature of resources, groups might find themselves jockeying with each other for position, whether it's school board positions or city council positions, etc. Again, these groups didn't create the rules. So the conflict is sort of baked into the process. It may not actually represent any racial animus, right? It just represents the fact that there are only so many city council seats. We can't share them. So are these groups really competing with each other? Or is it just the nature of the systems that they're operating within, right? That sort of privilege a certain kind of competition and absolutely are going to create competition. I mean, politics, after all, is a competitive business. And when we think about, again, the way that we are framing how these groups find each other or find themselves in contact with each other, I find that far too often these ideas, I've kind of said this, don't really take seriously how minority identity actually operates, right? Minority identity and sharing an identity as a excluded community or a minoritized community is only one way that we actually get to something that looks like working together. And even this idea of working together, I think, is something in a political realm that we talk about a lot, but at least we only really expect it out of people who are non-white. And part of it is that it's, I think, something that we hope to see because we view these groups as having common interests. But it's never really clear that these groups see themselves as common interests, as having common interests, excuse me. And when you think about a group like Black people, who among minority groups are some of the most politically incorporated, there may not be a reason to work with other groups, particularly if that group is viewed as being anti-Black. So on the previous slide, for example, I showed another red apple boycott from Brooklyn, New York from a couple summers ago, where there was an all-out melee between Black patrons of this business and the Asian employees of this business. And this was very reminiscent of the red apple boycott that Claire Jean Kim talks about in her work, Bitter Fruit. And much of the conversation around that was like, wow, this is so tragic. These groups don't see themselves like each other. But no one ever asked why they should. And certainly no one ever said, well, who has what to offer a coalition, right? And so in a place like New York City, or even in a place like Washington, D.C., Black communities are pretty well ensconced in the political environment. And so working together with others who may not be as politically viable may not be useful. And if we take Toure and Hamilton's argument about coalitions from Black power into consideration, then we have to close ranks first before we start working outside. And I've sort of mentioned this already, but the racial sort of parts of these kinds of coalition competition theories, which are useful, don't really think about how these groups start to come together in the first place, right? Or how these groups find themselves in relationship to each other in the first place, right? That everyone's opinion, everyone's ability to sort of move, to be mobile, etc., are constrained by these other kinds of systemic issues around class and in access, etc. So if we are going to talk about sort of inter-minority coalition or competition, to my mind, there is no way that you can do that and not talk about white people, and in particular, white supremacy. That is the system that favors white people and structures all of our life chances according to skin color, nationality, sexuality, language, etc. If you're going to talk about how minorities find themselves in these kinds of relationships, then it is absolutely fundamental to me that you bring whites back into the analysis. And this is what I'm attempting to do in my text. So I offer a theory of conflicted nativism, which I think helps sort of advance the conversation, because I don't want to move past a coalition conflict theories. I think they have a lot to teach us. But I do think it's important that we start thinking about the Black-white racial paradigm, not as passe, but as really the sort of framing for how these communities are coming together. And in particular, if you want to understand Black opinion from my perspective, then it is absolutely necessary that we privilege how Black people think about race here. And what I argue is that if we take that into consideration, that is, if we really sort of take in, listen to, and value what Black people say about race and their socialization around race, what becomes clear is that immigration is really a way for Black people to talk about their still impartial inclusion, right? That we are in an era of official colorblindness. And in a moment of official colorblindness, group-based remedies may be difficult to secure for the types of systemic racist practice that people experience. So what we do now is individualize racist practice. Some person did some bad thing to another person. So Derek Chauvin put his knee on the neck of George Floyd and murdered him. But we see that as disconnected from larger systems that devalue and dehumanize Black people, right? And if we do that, and to the extent that we do that, and we do it a lot in this country, we don't really get to this sort of deeper understanding of how Black people see racism. In my argument and in my theory, I argue that Blacks don't see racism as colorblind, certainly don't see America as colorblind, and don't experience racism necessarily as individuals, although individual bad things may happen. What is the case is that Black life becomes conditioned, right, by these systems of oppression. And what immigration does is help Black people articulate fears about their own exclusion and how the face of these new immigrants of color might actually be utilized by whites to further the white supremacist project. Therefore, when Black people are talking about immigration, what they're talking about is their own uncertainty and the way that race conditions Black life in the US, right? And so really, immigration is a cipher. It's not a thing, right, in and of itself that Black people are really concerned about. There is sort of no evidence that this is a top 10 issue for Black people. But what is racism and hate crimes, right? And so Durham, because of where I was located at the time, but also because Durham is a very fascinating place, is one of the sites that I talk about a lot in the text. And I devote a chapter to Durham as a case study because Durham, I think, is a racial exemplar. The city is largely Black and white, and there are these new incoming groups, but it's also Southern. And in many ways, when we talk about immigration, we are focused on California. We are focused on New York. We're focused on, traditional receiving context, Texas, Arizona. But we don't talk about the South. And the South, I think, has something really important to tell us because it shows how these sort of Black-white racial dynamics that have been in play for a really long time condition how these immigrants are seen. And also is an important site of racial learning. And I think that racial learning and that sort of memory of what race means is really significant for my work and how I think about it. So what are some of the big takeaways from the book, right? And one of the big ones is that Black people are pretty ambivalent about immigrants. They are not particularly hostile to them, but they don't particularly love them either. And I don't think that that should be required, but I think it needs to be said because there's a sense that because Black people have had these struggles with inclusion, that somehow, right, they're always and at all times supposed to be the sympathetic group. And I think that sympathy exists, right? But it is important to remember that Black people don't really do anything around the issue of immigration. if you ask them to tell you something, they'll say lots of things. But we also recognize that attitude is not behavior. So what people say about immigration and what people do about immigration are very different things. So Black people will tell you lots of things about it, but they don't necessarily mobilize around it. That's writing a letter to a congressman, that's going to a protest march, anything, right? And I do think that immigration is part of a Black political agenda. One, because we recognize that the Black community itself is becoming more diverse, but it's also the case that immigration, again, becomes a really important place for Black people to talk about what doesn't exist for them, what doesn't exist in their communities, what doesn't exist in terms of their life chances that they want to see. And looking at themselves next to new arrivals helps them crystallize that. So while immigration is not part of an agenda in a traditional sense, it is part of an agenda which helps Black people critique this project that we call America, right? And there's still a sense that systemic efforts to harm Black people are afoot, and that America is sort of the chief exemplar of that. And that if you look on most measures of Black well-being, whether it's home ownership, healthcare access, etc., it seems that Black people are right on the money in terms of their understandings of how race functions in America. And I would not sort of be a good scholar of Black politics if I did not lift up the late Nick Nelson here, right? And what he said to me one of the first times that I tried to present something about this research is that if you're not talking about white supremacy, you're not talking about anything. And I think that's exactly right. That when you're talking about Black politics and how Black people see race or think about race or utilize race, if you are not talking or thinking about white supremacy, you really won't, in my opinion, get to the richness that is this conversation. And also to lift up my now deceased colleague, Ron Walters, our deceased colleague, Ron Walters, right? What he says, what does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? And I think part of that liberation is, at least in this text, and what I do see this text as a liberatory project, is that I wanted to show that Black people are human, that we're not all saints, we're not all sinners, that Black people are just people. And we allow other communities to be just people all the time. And we don't really do that for Black people. And I think that's why we see some of these conversations as being recurrent, resurgent, and sort of always around. And that trope in particular of sort of Black hostility is one that I at least wanted to interrogate in some systematic fashion. So I'm going to say thank you and stop here and wait for Dr. Pérez's comments.
Okay, so thank you very much for that terrific presentation. Efrén, the floor is yours.
Okay. All right. All right, so thank you for the invitation. If you would have asked me in 2005 whether I was going to be about 15 years later, commenting on a book written by Niambi Carter, I would have said, you know, wouldn't that be something? And I'm glad that this opportunity happened. Niambi and I were peers, colleagues, now friends and colleagues in the discipline. And so we shared some of the same advisors, worked on very similar projects. We're sort of in that crucible where, you know, a lot of work on race and ethnicity and politics more generally, I think, came out of, even if we didn't want to think about it that way. So I'm going to try to be very focused on the comments and the questions that I have the book. I read the book when it was in draft form, and I read it and reread it when now that it has come out in print. But I think it's easier, in order to have a useful conversation, to really bore down on what I think are some of the strengths, and then some of the open questions that I think would be useful for future research to take up and build on this important work. So, the contributions that I see in this book are many, but I'm going to primarily underline two of them. So the first is that there is an incredibly important conceptual innovation here that has been sorely needed for quite a while now. And Dr. Carter's book is helping to address that need. And the one that I see that's perhaps more important and simple at the same time is that African Americans have more than just a racial identity, right? We tend to think of minoritized communities as simply operating on the basis of an identity that is the most stigmatized, in part because I think it's the most attention grabbing. But Professor Carter and the book she has published really sort of brings us a little bit away from that precipice and reminds us that Black individuals in particular, like most individuals, are actually quite complex and that they have a good reading of the racial terrain that they're actually in. I also think that on this front, the book tells us a lot about what is fruitful when we think a little bit harder about the possible interface between the identities that people share. And in this book, that interface consists of one between racial and national identity, which is actually not unlike a lot of the antagonists in her book, like Latinos, who also have to juggle and figure out how they're going to combine or not different forms of being. Lastly, I think the book on this particular contribution does a lot to broaden our appreciation for nuance in Black politics. And in this regard, Professor Carter's book is part of a string of manuscripts that have come online as of late, focused on the Black experience and really suspending a lot of unspoken assumptions that we have about how Black Americans operate and how they conduct their politics more generally. The second contribution that I want to highlight, especially if you have not read the book, is that it consists of very careful, in-depth work with what I'm going to call a non-traditional population. So if you believe what I have to say about what I find as major conceptual innovations, if you believe that business, part of why these kinds of insights have not been produced before, in some part, have to do with people staying away from trying to talk to hard to reach populations, right? So in some ways, a lot of what we don't know is because we have failed to ask, because we think that it's too difficult, too cumbersome to engage with other segments of the mass public. Now, I think in political science, Niambi probably faced an uphill climb because to this point, we do think of qualitative work on average as something that contributes to our methodological efforts, but nothing standalone. And so to her credit, I think what she has done is paired that in-depth work with some equally careful historical analyses, and then coupling that with some rich original survey data. And so what that has done, at least in a field like political science, which is, I think, overconsumed with quantitative work, is essentially she's able to lay out her argument and provide some convincing evidence to different audiences, right within what we know as political science. So where do I see this book situated, right? I think that's sort of one of the ways that it is exciting to welcome a new book, is to think through where it might fit and what additional insights it might lead to. So I personally, as a political psychologist who studies race and ethnicity, see this book as fitting in this growing segment of scholarship in political science that is trying to call attention to the psychological complexity of people of color, African Americans included, right? And I think that's a good thing. And to give you a sense of how important that is, for the longest time, and I think especially when Niambi was in graduate school, anytime you set up yourself to conduct work on quote unquote non-traditional populations, I think there was sort of a sense of, it was easy to dismiss that kind of work, right? Because people could say, well, at the end of the day, the majority is actually not Hispanic white, right? And so that's, by implication, that's where all the action is. That is increasingly untenable And so I would say Niambi was a little bit ahead of the curve on that front. And I think now she has laid out a template, or at least a blueprint, for why it's important to broaden our horizons in terms of what we know about the various elements in this multiracial, multi-ethnic polity that we call the United States. I think more importantly, I see this work as renewing a deserved focus on racial hierarchy and sometimes the perverse incentives that it sets up for political behavior and misbehavior among people of color. And so here is what I mean. So Dr. Carter is essentially calling attention to the fact that African Americans consider themselves Black and American, and that's sort of a unique experience. And that is consistent with what we're learning about the very nuanced way in which racial hierarchy works in the United States, at least in contemporary times. So what you see here is an adaptation from work published by Linda Zhao and Seth Nacharian, two leading social psychologists. And what they argue is that all racial and ethnic groups, whites included, can be arrayed along two dimensions in America's stratification. How American or foreign are they perceived to be and see themselves as? And then how superior or inferior are these groups seen, and how do they see themselves as along that dimension? So what you can gather from this rendition is there is a lot to what that is correct about what Dr. Carter puts forth in her book. In this rendition of America's racial order, you'll see that with respect to whites, African Americans, like their Latino counterparts, are considered a more relatively inferior group, right, on socially speaking. But when it comes to the foreign American dimension, unlike their Latino and Asian American counterparts, African Americans are deemed relatively more American, right? In contrast, if you see Asian Americans, like their Latino counterparts, are construed as a relatively more foreign group, but unlike African Americans and unlike Latinos, they actually are viewed and see themselves as a more socially superior group. And so this is sort of the cage that we're talking about, right? These are sort of some of the incentives that allow us to become sort of prisoners of this very cage. And as Niambi sort of highlights in her book, the source of this discomfort, tension, and outright violence at times comes from the fact that everything is happening with respect to how these groups orbit the non-Hispanic white population. So my main takeaways are that even as a relatively marginalized group, Black individuals have an enormous degree of political agency, with their American identity being one specific pathway. And I think that's sort of important to remember in discussions, in conceptualizations, in theorizations about groups that are subordinated. Having a lower rank doesn't mean that you don't have any control, right? That's what I would say. Second, I would say another main takeaway is that to understand Black politics and perhaps the politics of people of color more generally, talk to them, appreciate their perspective on their terms. It seems like such an uncontroversial idea, but sometimes instead of starting off with the assumption that we know what these communities may be thinking, it might be useful to just ask them and then base our theoretical and conceptual efforts, conceptualization efforts on those. Okay, so what are some blind spots in the argument and evidence? And again, these are colored basically from my angle as a political behavior scholar. It's not, you know, my angle as a generalist by any stretch. So with the term conflicted nativism, one question I had, and I think one question that more skeptical readers could have is, why does the nativism have to be conflicted, right? So if you read the book very closely, there is a lot of hesitation, a lot of hedging, a lot of qualifying the expressions and criticisms that her African-American respondents have about Latino immigrants in particular. And so my question would simply be, couldn't this just be a function of social desirability? They're equivocating, but the ultimate sort of sentiment is one that I'm not a big fan, right? And Niambi said that, but it might be not just I'm not a big fan, I really don't like you. So it's hard to rule out, at least from my perspective, without additional empirical work that is not as equivocal. And I actually don't think that it's that problematic that they can express more miserly attitudes toward their minoritized peers or co-communities, if you will. So I think probably one possible alternative to consider, and again, I mean, it's to be determined, is that African Americans can be nativist under some circumstances, that nativism can lead to hostility toward other groups under some circumstances, but prejudice doesn't equal power or supremacy in a racial order where you have the lower station or rank. And I think that's sort of the way I can see, you know, some blind spots in the book and then still say, but it opens our eyes to how things operate, right? Because in as much as different groups can, or members of different groups can express hostility, prejudice, racism, that's not the same thing as structural oppression, right? And so what I think I would have liked to see a little bit more is a conversation about those two possibilities and how they feed into our understanding, not only of Black politics, but I think the politics of people of color more generally. And in particular, because I think unwittingly or not, sometimes certain members of these communities of color do end up undertaking certain behaviors and expressing certain attitudes that essentially reinforce their own stigmatization, right? Perverse as it may be. The other aspect of the book that I think I would like to hear more about, you know, you can't put everything into a book, is how the Black experience as Americans, as Black Americans can actually serve to build solidarity at opportune political moments. I think Niambi is incredibly right that if you focus on the attitudes and the psychology of these groups, you come away with a lot of insight, but you get a very impoverished view about why that psychology is the way it is. And it does have everything to do with the structure, like the way that these groups are actually ordered or stratified as. And as part of that, I would also want to know a little bit more about what the Black experience can teach us about the experience of other people of color in the United States, whether that is by example, whether that is by outright overtures. You know, essentially, what can scholars who focus on other communities take away, right, that is immediately applicable to their own individual endeavors? That is what I have to say. If you couldn't tell, I was a big fan of the book. It's kind of hard not to be. Basically, I drank the same Kool-Aid as Niambi, but you know, I was really glad that I got to at least voice what I really enjoyed about the book, because I've been running around in my head with a lot of those comments since I read it when it first came out. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Efrén. That was a terrific comment. So maybe we should all try to drink the same Kool-Aid. We'd be better off. So, okay, Niambi, over to you.
Oh, that was great. I mean, I appreciate these comments. And I think, you know, these are some really hard questions. And I think sometimes for me, and I can't say I think, for me, right, these are things that I'm turning over too. And I think the reason I use conflicted is not because it has to be, right? People can be baldly whatever they want to be. But I think it's conflicted because I do believe, to a certain extent, Black people see that they are supposed to be the exemplars of what justice looks like in America. So saying that, you know, these people are like X, right? These people don't know that they can put toilet paper in the toilet and flush it and it'll be fine, is viewed as like, dang, that's racist. And so I don't want to be racist, because to be racist is to be like white people. And I recognize that I don't have this power, so that people can say these kind of stereotypical bigoted things, but because they don't have power, they don't necessarily see it in the same way. But they are astute enough to recognize that the language that they're using would not be okay, right, in the general sense. So I think that's why it's conflicted. It doesn't have to be, but I think perhaps that's why, if I had to hazard a guess, But I do think your sort of, your last question about sort of what can the Black experience tell us? And I think that's a really significant one, because I think, you know, we've been having this conversation a lot, I think, in this contemporary moment that we're in, where once again, we are talking about anti-Asian violence and Black perpetrators. And there were a couple of really high profile events that happened, the one in New York, and I believe there was one in either Minnesota or somewhere like that, where there were Blacks who had attacked Asian people. And again, it feels like 1992 all over again, right? When we're having these conversations about how Black people are so hostile, so hostile, so hostile. And we can look with this, and with the same straight face, at a white man who gunned down 6 Asian women and 2 others. And yet we're not talking about the pandemic of white violence against Asian communities. And there's this really, you know, to use your language, of perverse incentives, where the tropes of sort of, I think, Black hostility, criminality, et cetera, are easy to hang our hats on. And I think if we're being aware, right, that part of what we have to ask ourselves constantly, I think, as communities of color, and communities that are often pitted against each other, right? Asians are used as a cudgel, right, against Blacks, against Latinos and others, to say, see, if you all had the right culture and you behaved, then you could be like these people. And what we're always talking about here is exclusion, exclusion, exclusion. The racial order is dynamic and it's not at the same time. And I think, you know, if we are sort of circumspect about all of this, what purpose does it serve? And I think the Black experience at least gives people some sense about what purpose it serves. And the purpose it serves is a sort of preservation of whiteness and white supremacy as a foundation that, Lord, kind of goes unquestioned. Because if we can break down the sort of hate crimes conversation to it's Black people who are the perpetrators, even though there's never been a history of Blacks coordinating attacks against other communities, of Blacks rounding up other people, those fears are totally irrational. It's not to diminish the very real acts of violence that happen. But it is certainly the case that if we're talking about mob violence in America, we're really talking about white people. That is a documented history. Yet we talk about Black people as the face of that violence. And so I think it's a really important sort of lesson on how these sort of racial orders become inculcated and become static. And it's the very, I mean, and it doesn't matter, right, that, you know, Asian Americans are a relatively high status group, right, and a sort of approximate whiteness. Your barriers to full inclusion are around these very same things that people praise Asian communities for: industriousness, thriftiness, culture, family, right? Those are the things that people say make Asian people successful, but it's also the things that make people resent Asian people, and why people ask Asian people, where are you from? Oh, you speak English so well. Never thinking about Asian people as truly fully American. And I think the same thing happens with Latinos, right? The sort of way in which, you know, a few years ago, we were having all of these conversations, MS-13, it has infiltrated America and we have to start cracking down on these Mexicans. And I mean, and everybody Latino is Mexican, right? That conversation becomes very, very one-dimensional. And the whole Latino world is flattened into one place, and Mexico becomes the source of all angst, and Mexican people, who are the most indigenous, right, become suspect, foreign, criminal, dangerous. And so I think the Black experience should be a cautionary tale to many people about how buying into these stereotypes can really become a threat to your group becoming full citizens, not necessarily to your group social mobility, right? Because everybody's experiencing these structural differences differently, right? Asians do very well, right, as competitive as whites. But when you look at the ways in which Asian people are sort of treated as sort of other, that shows you how even buying into those stereotypes can be dangerous. And then I think about the sort of what can the Black experience teach us about the experiences of other people of color, is that if you look both historically, I think even in the contemporary moment, the borders of Blackness are very porous. There are lots of communities that have had to either live with, right, service and other kinds of things, Black communities, because they didn't know what to do with them. The world was very, are you white or not? And to the extent that you were non-white, then you were Black in terms of how you were treated. And I think part of, like, you know, conversations we have about Jim Crow and segregation is that we forget that Latino people in Texas, in Arizona, in California, indigenous people in Arizona, New Mexico, all experience that very same system differently. And when we were talking about integration, for example, how do we get around it? Well, we're going to call Latino people white, and we're going to put them in the schools with the Black kids. So technically we've integrated, but we've done it at the expense at these other brown people, right? Because we certainly were going to sacrifice our white children's education for this. And so I think it's one of the things that, at least for me, that has always become clear is how easy it is for non-white peoples to become Blackened, not Black, right? To maintain a sort of a barrier around whiteness. And I think that sort of cut point, right, for when you are sort of okay and when you are not okay looks different for every group, but it is very clear that if the priority is whiteness, then all of these other communities, for all intents and purposes, are Black, because we had a very white, non-white kind of organization here. I think it's gotten a little better. And I think I am also heartened by the places where we see groups forming solidarity. So some of those places where I see that happening are around issues like voting rights, right? So whether we're talking about Georgia or Texas or Arizona, and these places that are sort of in the very near future looking to Georgia for a model, right? Georgia's voting rights crackdown was about Black voters in that state. But when you go to Texas, it's about Black and Latino voters. When you go to Arizona, it's about Native and Latino voters. And I think those are really important generative places where these groups can coalesce and be in solidarity with each other. We don't just have our pain, right? To your point about sort of how people, racial identity is one, pain is one, but that's not the only place where we can coalesce. We don't just have to coalesce around our pain and around grievance, right? There can be some very generative places. Educational access, for example, these affirmative action cases. I mean, I have been really sort of happy to see sort of Asian American organizations saying like, this is not the way, right, to achieve access, and bringing in sort of Black groups with them, and Black groups saying, we want to partner with you so that we can combat these sort of common stereotypes around, say, affirmative action and about Black undeservingness. And I think, you know, this is to Maria's point in the chat, right? Race doesn't matter until you're not white. And I think that's a really sort of poignant, really sweet kind of way to kind of wrap this up, is that the lesson isn't in being Black. The lesson is in being not white. So I think that.
Okay, on that note, okay, thank you so much. So why don't we segue to the to discussion? You can either send me questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. So at the moment, I don't see any. David.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Niambi. I had a question. I don't know if you've had a chance to read the new book by Jennifer Jones on the browning of the New South.
I haven't. It's actually on my list of all the things I need to read.
Okay. So maybe I'll reformulate this, but you know, it's interesting because she's a sociologist and she did her field work in a different part of North Carolina in Winston-Salem. But the story that she tells is one of a lot of mobilization, active mobilization on the part of both African Americans and Latino immigrants around migrant rights issues. And it's a story of shared linked fate across that ethno-racial divide. So I guess, I mean, I can't ask you to react to the book if you haven't read it, but I mean, I'm wondering if you might just have some kind of broad sense about whether that could potentially be the result of differences within North Carolina, or if there's some other possible cause for that very, very different story and your account and hers.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it might be just that Winston and Durham are very different places. So one of the things that's really interesting about Durham is never covered by the Voting Rights Act, because that's how many Black people were registered to vote by that time. So that tells you something about Durham. I mean, Durham had a very strong middle class of Black folks who were very active, and two of the biggest sort of firms, Black-owned firms, Mechanic and Farmers Bank and North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance, were based in Durham. So Durham had a very different profile. I mean, it shared many of the same issues as a place like Winston, but Winston, I think, stayed rural longer. And so Winston is a different kind of place. But the other thing I think that makes perhaps Durham interesting is that, you know, in the sort of early 2000s, you had a lot of jockeying and jostling around sort of how these groups were going to work out some of their differences around like education. So I guess it was early 2000s where there was a lot of concern about bilingual education and the provision of bilingual education. And with some Black parents being very concerned that their children who were already missing valuable resources were now going to be without because of the provision of bilingual education. But it was some really interesting, I think, organizing work happening there, where I think groups were trying to find commonality and trying to think about how this doesn't have to be an either or proposition, right? So how is, you know, the provision of these resources for these children not necessarily mean a deficit for other children? And so there have been, you know, groups like Durham Can, which was organizing like congregations and other groups to work together and trying to use sort of faith-based institutions, but also nonprofit organizations and other kind of community-based organizations to bring people together. And those people being, you know, Black, Latino, and others who were fighting really similar fights, but didn't necessarily have a way to bring their common grievance together. So, you know, I can't comment on her book directly, but I do think there was some rough going there, right? Like this was not going to be you know, an easy story. And one of the kind of early areas of breakdown was over sort of a Black Catholic church being sort of the site for newly arriving, or being designated the site for newly arriving immigrants to Durham. And that Black Catholic church was not having it in terms of their identity. And of course, the diocese made this decision without any input, thinking, oh, these people are going to see themselves alike. But it didn't actually turn out that way. And in part, what Blacks were resistant to were not necessarily that the immigrant folks were there, and of course, having separate services in Spanish and other kinds of things, bringing their own sort of religious images into the institution, was that, but their institution was not being respected, right? That they were not necessarily consulted about how this was going to work, and weren't even sort of given, I think, an opportunity to really express what they saw as their sort of unique identity in that city, as a Black Catholic parish. And so you saw some, I think, real challenges in that space because of these lack of discussion. So that is not an answer per se, but I do think Durham is unique in the way that its Black population has been maneuvering in that city for a very long time, that make it different from a place like Winston, which isn't that far away, but Winston has a very different sort of setup.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So now a question from a member of the audience, Dennis Lopez. And Dennis asks, can you comment on African-American views of African immigrants and Black immigrants from countries outside of the African continent?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, I wasn't necessarily doing that work. That's more the work that, Candace Watts Smith and Christina Greer, Alana Hackshaw, Minna DeMessi, they kind of did work on sort of those kinds of questions. But when asked about what group they felt closest to, Blacks did cite Black immigrants first, right? So there does appear to be some within group fealty, and that was also reflected on the CMPS, the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, the 2016 one, where Blacks were asked whether they thought it was important that they advocate on behalf of Black undocumented people, and they said mostly that it was important, or at least somewhat important. So I think what we're finding with the sort of Black undocumented population, which is just starting to sort of, I think, come to our popular consciousness, right? That when we say Black people, that we're not just talking about Black Americans. It has taken a while, because I think we have treated Blackness as uncomplicated. It's not variable, right? It's just, we're talking about these kinds of people who had, a sort of experience with America as enslaved people who became free, who became citizens, and all this other kind of stuff. But we've not really complicated this idea of who Black people are, even though we've known for a long time from the work of Mary Waters and other people, that Blacks from the Caribbean and the continent were coming to the US and really engaging with Black people. I mean, look at Shirley Chisholm. She's American born, but the child of immigrants who goes back to her parents' home country and is raised there, and then comes back to the United States and represents Brooklyn, Flatbush in particular, which had a strong Black American population, but also a very strong Caribbean population that had been there for decades, but yet they were all Black. And we saw the same thing with, Representative Clark, also out of New York, that is now represented by Yvette Clarke. These kinds of linkages have always been there, but I don't think we've taken them up, in part, I think, because of the exigencies of race, where it's like, yeah, you may have an accent, yeah, you may come from someplace else, but you're going to catch hell, not because of those things, but because you're Black, which is why, Rogers and others have found that, some immigrant communities do want to maintain that distinction, because they are trying to stave off the downward mobility that comes with being Black American and the stigma that comes from being Black American, quite frankly. So there's some evidence, right, that, Black people see members from these other places as a part of their community, even if they don't see them as exactly like them, right? I mean, they have different experiences. Many of these communities do understand oppression, they understand white supremacy, they understand exclusion, but they also get the same messages about Black American criminality, about Black Americans having, poor cultural values. All of those things that we say to other people are also being said to Black communities around the world. And then they come to the United States in some cases, and they're having their first experience with race American style, right? Where people are not asking you, oh, where do you come from? People just like, oh, you're Black, and I'm going to treat you the way that I treat Black Americans. And, whether we look at, the case of Abner Louima or even Amadou Diallo, both immigrants, one murdered and one horribly abused by police. You saw Black communities, primarily American Blacks, but, in league with Caribbean and African Blacks protesting those events, because these things happened to these individuals because they were Black, not because they were immigrants, right? Being immigrant complicated, right, the question, because partly what Amadou Diallo was reaching for was papers, right, to show that he was where he was supposed to be. But that sort of initial impulse to stop him was because he was Black. And so there have been and continue to be, I think, moments of great solidarity between Black Americans and these African and Caribbean groups in a place like DC, for example, there are public facing commissions. There's one for African affairs and there's another one for African American affairs. And I think that's to signal the importance of both of these communities, but also the sort of very different ways that they are experiencing the city. And then you have organizations like Black Alliance for Just Immigration that have been doing a lot of, I think, advocacy work. So not only just to bring in sort of some of the mainline Black organizations that we know, but also to just increase general awareness that issues like DACA, for example, also affect Black communities, that hyper surveillance and over policing of communities doesn't just have ramifications for Black Americans, it also has ramifications for Black immigrants who live in those very same communities and are more likely to be arrested, charged, and deported, right? Because of those things. So those kinds of groups are also doing a lot of work to I think, raise awareness in Black communities of all stripes about these sort of commonalities and these important kinds of things. And then if you read any sort of Black media outlets, I think you get lots of really interesting kinds of stories. So like in Amsterdam News, or even like the Griot or the Root, which are more popular, you're starting to see more of those things come up and more of those questions come up. And then I think even with the popularity of some figures, whether it's the rapper Wale, who is from this area but is Nigerian American, Yvonne Orji, who is a comedian who's just had a huge special on HBO, but also is on the popular show Insecure, where she plays an African American. And of course she is, but she's also Nigerian American. And so I think there's becoming a greater awareness, not that it was never there before, but I do think that we are coming to a place where we are now recognizing and starting to think about Blackness outside of Black communities in more complicated ways. And I think even Black organizations and Black community members who are representing these communities are having to think in more concrete terms about what does Blackness actually mean for the community that I live in. Like if you're in a place like where I am, that means you have to think about West Africans, East Africans, folks from Trinidad, lots of folks from Grenada, and Black Americans, right? If you're in a place like Georgia, there are lots of Haitian immigrants in Georgia that you have to be considerate of. And because it's such a hub for so many kinds of industries, you're also getting Black folks with roots on the continent. And I think this is becoming more usual than it has been previously, even though there's this long history of sort of Black Pan-Africanist kinds of organizing and conversation. I don't think that there had been a lot of sort of complication of what it means to be Black. And I think scholars are becoming much more sensitive to that. And I think Black people themselves are becoming perhaps more sensitive to that.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but so let me then let me then pose a question. And I want to come back to your opening quote from Du Bois and to double consciousness. And so, I mean, there it seems to me you're emphasizing essentially two particularisms. That is, on one, two particularisms, that is membership in the Black community, or one which can take the form in a kind of nationalist form, understanding member of a Black nation, and of course, membership in the American nation, the American people, and that the goal is that these become fully compatible, that being Black and being an American are in no ways contradictory, and that one can be fully American while being Black. And it seems to me that this essentially is the claim that is advanced by most communities of color. That is, that these two identities should be completely compatible, and there should be no tension between them. But nonetheless, both of those identities are still particularistic. These are not cosmopolitan points of view. These are not embracing of all the world's people, but it's a particular conception of the we that we should be. So we should be if you a multi-ethnic, a multicolored we, but some type of collectivity, some type of people. And so I'm wondering though whether that belief in peoplehood isn't inherently in tension with immigration, which after all involves the movement of foreigners, of the entrance of people who are not citizens. And so if we think internally, if we think about views of peoplehood, our view is, well, all members of the people should be treated equally. There should be no second-class citizen. Everybody should be a first-class citizen. But that doesn't imply that all the non-citizens should be citizens. And so I'm wondering whether, especially if you focus on the outward aspect, on the immigration versus views or interactions with immigrants who are around us, whether we shouldn't, whether our baseline assumption shouldn't be that there will be some degree of opposition to immigration, that immigration inherently is going to generate an exclusionary response, regardless of what segment of the population one is looking at.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think in some ways, I think there is a sensibility that, newcomers are always threats to whatever the established status quo is, right? And that there will be a period of adjustment and then people kind of move on once they realize these people are here to stay, they want to be a part, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know that it necessarily has to be that way. And in part because I think about, sort of our immigration sort of system here, which at least at the founding was very permissive, right? I mean, the only real requirement was to be white. And so, I don't know that it necessarily has to be tense with newcomers. And I'm thinking here, I'm just sort of thinking through this question because I do think it's a really provocative one. I'm thinking about the work of like Bonnie Honig in her book, Democracy and the Foreigner. And I think the way she asked the question was really important. It's like, well, what purpose do immigrants function? Like, what work do they do for the Republic? And it's not just about sort of disruption of the status quo, but it is a sort of, I think, constant reminder of who we are and who we want to be, who we profess to be. And so that it is the case that maybe immigrants could engender the worst of us. It is also the case that immigrants could make us better, right? That if we say, these are the truths that we hold self-evident, right? That if you say that these are the things that we believe in, then someone sort of choosing you affirms the sort of goodness and the rightness of those things that you say you believe in, right? That somebody wants to leave the place that they're in. And I'm using voluntary leaving because we know leaving can be very dicey, right? People leave for all kinds of reasons. But assuming that people leave their home countries under the best circumstances, right? They're going to make a choice about where they want to be situated in the world. And they're choosing you. Then that is saying something about who you are. So clearly who you are is desirable. The organization that you have as a nation is something that people would want to associate with, would want to come be a part of. And so it to my mind, right, this idea of immigrants is sort of upsetting the apple cart and disturbing a notion of who we are doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And it is also, I think, predicated on the notion of we are a unified we, right? That we know who that is, right? Who we are as a people, what constitutes being an American or what constitutes being Argentinian or something, right? Like we have a very clear sensibility about what that is. And I think I know what it is to be an American, but I don't know that I do. And I don't know that my vision of America comports with, say, what 75 million other Americans believe about what this country means, right? Like, I don't know that that is the case. And so that I think maybe perhaps immigrants can help clarify that. I think they can help us maybe revise that.
Mhm.
And I also wonder to whom it becomes a threat, right? And under what circumstances? Because I think that's also an important part of this. I mean, because the different, I think, postures that we take toward immigrants are not disassociated from all of the things that we might be experiencing as a place, right? Depending on what's happening with us, depending on how secure people feel, depending on sort of what the economic cycle looks like, right? We might have an experience with immigration or immigrant people at one point in time that we may not have at another, right? So we can think about sort of the moment that we're in right now, where, 10 months, 12 months ago, or I don't know, how long have we been in this nonsense? Over a year now, right? But 13, 14 months ago, with that particular president and with that particular political environment, it probably wasn't a good time. Maybe, 48 months before that, it might have been a slightly better time. I think, the ways in which immigrants are sort of treated, used for various political ends, is highly dependent on the time. And so whether we believe in immigrants as being able to be part of us or view them with suspicion, I think really just depends on sort of what we are going through as a nation. And I don't know that all roads have to lead to conflict.
Okay.
But I
terrific.
do think I do think that at least that Honic text just keeps coming back to me, right? Because she's talking about sort of the different ways that we can formulate a notion of immigrant and how it can look differently. And she's of course using, popular things like Wizard of Oz and Shane and these other sort of moments, even biblical stories about the immigrant. But I do think it is an important thing to think about in that why does it become negative and when it becomes negative? Because I can imagine a place where, or a time when it doesn't have to be that.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. So a question from Zoli Hajnal. Did you notice major differences in how Black Americans talked about Latino immigrants and Asian American immigrants?
Not really, because I was kind of at least talking more generally about immigration. And then I was also, asking people specifically about Latino people, because I think I had a little bit of tunnel vision at that time, just thinking about where I was in terms of um, uh, with the work. But I did ask a question about, who people thought they had the most in common with. And outside of course, other Black people, it was Latinos first and then Asians second. And I think, and white people's last. And that was true. And I think in part, perhaps what I was picking up, or why people saw those relationships as different, is because of this view of Asian people as perhaps white adjacent. And that, yes, they're minoritized communities, but the way they experience their racial life is very different than, say, the way that Latinos or Black people do. And so there was some sense that I think Asians do better, right, than other people. And that wouldn't be too far off from what we know, right? If you think about the sort of major areas like educational attainment, incomes, etc. Of course, there are nationality differences, so we know the AAPI world is complicated as well. But I think the general sense is that that Latinos were closer to Blacks, and that was the group that Black people felt they had most affinity with, and then Asians behind them. And I think part of something that I picked up, or something that came up again, was sort of these notions about business ownership and, who gets to have things. And I think there was a sensibility that perhaps Asians get more stuff. And none of this is based in fact, right? These are things that people hear. there were more than one occasion where people were saying things about immigrants having access to capital to start businesses. And this common misconception that immigrants don't pay taxes for a specified period of time. And that's how they're able to sort of marshal the resources to start businesses and do these things. Now, of course, I didn't, disabuse any one of these incorrect notions, but I was just more struck that that was a sentiment that people had, that there was a belief that there's something else afoot that is happening that enables immigrants to do better than native-born Black folks. And what happens in their mind is that there are these sort of institutional practices that help immigrants of all stripes. But certainly if you're looking at sort of who people are living proximate to and who people are finding themselves most in conversation with, it's Latino immigrants. And that Asians seem to be doing okay, right, relative to these other communities. So I didn't see necessarily any more or less hostility, but certainly people did express an outward sense that that Asians were the least like them of the sort of non-white categories than Latino people. And I think, again, bringing that back to the sort of contemporary present moment that we're in, where we're seeing a lot of conversation about anti-Asian hate crimes, right? The conversation again is about sort of how Asian communities are exceptional, and why perhaps they're being singled out for this kind of violence. And some speculating, and again, none of this I don't think is empirical, right? But speculating that because Asian people are viewed as perhaps easy targets, because they are not necessarily seen in the same way as other minoritized communities, that they are particularly rife for these kinds of acts of violence and abuse. And, I don't know, right, is the short answer. But when you look at the imperfect hate crimes data that does exist, most victims of hate crimes are still Black and most perpetrators are still white. And this is not to diminish sort of what is happening to Asian people, but I think the conversation sort of lacks context. And part of the reason that it lacks context is because we don't think through how different groups experience othering differently, right? So I had the privilege of being on a panel on Tuesday with the AAPI data folks, and they just put out data they just collected in the last month, which show that Asian Americans are certainly reporting more hate crimes, but they find that their Black respondents are also reporting an uptick in those kinds of experiences. That the way that the Asian population that they spoke to were experiencing their exclusion was in the sense of people thinking of them as foreigners, but they were not experiencing discrimination in sort of housing the way that Black and Pacific Islander respondents and even Latino respondents were. They were not viewed as criminal. People did not view them as untrustworthy in the way that they did Black and Latino respondents. I mean, and certainly they had fewer experiences being dissuaded from achieving higher educational outcomes in the way that Pacific Islanders and others in that data in that survey had. And so I think this points to the need to sort of back away from sort of this unitary kind of talk about sort of minorities and get into the nitty gritty, because all of these groups are experiencing threat, danger, exclusion, but all very differently. And in my case, at least, Blacks seem to think of Asians as having more than other minority communities, whether that was true or not. There was a sense that Asians were doing better and better off than Black and Latino communities.
Okay, thank you. So we just have a few minutes left. So just a follow-up from, okay, I'm going to put together two follow-ups. One relating to how Indigenous Americans are viewed, and second, a perception of Middle Eastern immigrants. So if you could briefly respond, because we'll need to wrap up.
Did you
very
say
soon.
indigenous? Indigenous.
Indigenous Americans and
Okay.
then Middle Eastern immigrants.
So I didn't ask anything about those communities, to be quite frank. I would just say I don't really have a good read on that. I would not want to hazard a guess. But in terms of Muslim immigrants, I think that there could be some really interesting things there, in part because when you're talking about Islam in the US, the face of Islam in the US is a black face, right? There are many black converts in this country. And I'm thinking about the work of Natalie Masuoka and Matt Barretto, just from maybe about a 10 years ago or so, was looking at sort of Muslim folks, and what they were picking up, if I'm not mistaken, from some of the sites that they were looking at were a lot of Black people. I think many of whom were African-American converts to Islam. So I don't have a good read on that, but I think that there could be some really interesting overlaps because of the prevalence of Islam and some pretty prominent Black folks who've become Islam. And I don't mean just sort of strict Muslims, but or strict adherents of Islam. I also mean even the Nation of Islam, right? I mean, that is, I don't think, a strict interpretation of the religion of Islam. Nonetheless, I think the nation has been integral for people thinking about Black people thinking about Islam as a viable religious tradition for them to follow. And when you look at El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, right, sort of making that transition from the Nation of Islam to traditional Muslim practice, I think you might find some really interesting things there. But I didn't, and I did not look at indigenous communities, and that is one area where I will say I've fallen down. But I will say that might be a little complicated in a place like North Carolina, because North Carolina has state recognized tribes, and those state recognized tribes and Black communities have very iffy relationships, in part because of the sense that those people who are state recognized members, one, are people who didn't necessarily want to be Black anymore. I'm not suggesting that's true, but I think that exists in some places in the state, and that they get benefits and services that Black people do not get. And therefore, I think that could be a little complicated and may not give a full picture of how people think about sort of real indigenous people. And I'm not trying to diminish anyone's identity, but I think that is a complicated story to tell in a place like North Carolina, where you have lots of state recognized tribes, and it can get a little, the racial politics around that can be very, very hostile and very tense. Let's not say hostile, let's say tense.
Okay, well, terrific. So obviously we could continue forever, but our time is limited. So I want to thank Professor Carter for a great presentation, and for Professor Pérez for a very stimulating comment. Thanks to our audience. We hope to see you here next week for a discussion of another very interesting book. So bye, everyone. Have a great weekend, and hoping to see you on next Friday.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for showing up.